Welcome back to watching Business Incorporated live on Channels Television. Now to our next conversation. Well, approval for much-needed $1.4 billion credit facility for Zambia by the IMF is expected to boost investor confidence and unlock further financing facilities in the aftermath of a debt default by the southern African country. Zambia, under President Hakainde Hichilema, following the out of former leader Edgar Lungu, been hard-pressed for external financing after it defaulted on a $42.5 million Eurobond coupon repayment at the end of last year. Well, let's see what this deal means for the country. I'm being joined by practice leader, Sub-Saharan Africa at Frontier View, Matt Kindiger. Great to have you, Matt.
Hi, thanks for having me on the program today.
Yeah, so how will the IMF deal affect the government's ability to negotiate with creditors and exit a default?
Yeah, so this is a very significant deal and certainly a step in the right direction. It's worth remembering that this is a staff level agreement. It still needs final approval. In our view, it will be approved and confirmed. So generally that is positive, but it's also worth remembering that this comes in addition to over $1 billion that the Zambian government received from its SDR allocation earlier this year. So Zambia, by the beginning of next year, will have received over $2 billion from the IMF. In terms of what this means for Zambia's debt restructuring prospects, certainly it is positive. Zambia's current total government debt is over $27 billion. That's over 100% of GDP. More than 60% of this is international, and more than 10% of this is held by commercial bondholders. So certainly this is a step in the right direction. What this will mean is that the Zambian government will have more leverage when it comes to debt negotiation or debt restructuring negotiations, including with bilateral lenders such as the Chinese, as well as private sector bondholders. So we would expect to see some progress in 2022. But in terms of Zambia being able to exit default, this really does depend on the implementation or the effective implementation of the restructuring of public finances and the conditionality associated with this latest IMF deal. But crucially, the state of public finances will still continue to be determined by copper prices and copper production. These remain incredibly important in Zambia in terms of the government's ability to raise public finances or raise tax revenue, but also instill confidence amongst lenders that will be lending to the government. So certainly a step in the right direction, but there are a lot of things that need to happen before we see Zambia exit default and stabilize public finances.
Well, they have their job gone out for them with this one. How has the private sector, responded to Hichilema's presidency, and what does this mean for the country's growth outlook?
Certainly, Hichilema's presidency has been welcomed by the private sector, and this is because he's generally viewed as taking the right steps in terms of improving governance standards, overhauling public finances. This latest IMF deal sends a very positive signal to investors, but also companies operating domestically in Zambia. What we have seen in terms of sentiment indicators such as the Purchasing Managers Index, which is a survey of the private sector in the country. What we have seen is positive numbers emerge from Zambia recently, and this is after a very long period of very clearly negative sentiment. So this reflects the country's improved governance outlook, but also what we're seeing as a result of higher copper prices. So Zambia is a big miner, a big copper producer. So certainly the private sector is a lot more upbeat about the country's prospects as a result of elevated commodity prices. However, there is still some skepticism in the private sector around what the IMF deal means for the country's outlook and the operating environment for them. So, for example, the IMF may include in its conditionality the requirement of withdrawing certain subsidies, such as farming and fuel subsidies. If this does happen, it is beneficial for the government's public finances. However, it could affect the operating costs for companies. It could affect sentiment in sectors like farming, and it could also raise the cost of doing business because of higher fuel prices. So certainly there is a degree of concern and skepticism there. In terms of the country's growth outlook, So the private sector is more upbeat. We are expecting the private sector really to lead the growth outlook, will be the main driver for growth next year. But really, the most important thing in Zambia is the copper price and copper production. The government has the ambition of tripling tripling copper production over the next 3 years to 3 million tons per year. And if this happens, Zambia's economic prospects are relatively bright. But if copper production disappoints or copper prices fall over the next year or so, then we would expect Zambia's economy to struggle. So our base case view is that the economy should grow by about 3% next year.
I guess that's one of the challenges of overdependence on one asset there. Well, the kwacha has strengthened considerably since Hichilema became president. Where do you see it heading over the next year?
Yeah, certainly. So the kwacha has outperformed expectations, supported by a much more upbeat investor view towards Zambia. So Hichilema has encouraged some portfolio inflows into the country. We've also seen the SDR allocations from the IMF earlier this year supporting the country's forex reserves, and also higher copper prices. That has also bolstered the kwacha. In terms of the outlook, so the kwacha has started to depreciate again, and we are expecting some gradual depreciation throughout 2022. And this is going to be driven by increasing demand for imports as private sector sentiment increases. And generally, this won't be matched as immediately by improving export revenues. However, if copper prices remain elevated, and if they continue, if they increase from where they are at the moment, and if exports, especially copper production and copper exports, increase beyond expectations, then we could see a further strengthening of the kwacha. In terms of our view, so we would expect an annual average of about 19.9 this year and 20.6 in 2022. So very moderate depreciation, quite considerable stability, and this is quite an improvement on the recent experience of the kwacha in Zambia. So although we are expecting some depreciation, certainly it will be a much more stable currency environment in Zambia, especially compared to the last couple of years.
Okay. All right, Matt Kinniger, practice lead, Sub-Saharan Africa at Front of You. Always great to have you on the program. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.